Welcome everyone to NSTA Web Seminars, where you can find live interactive learning at your desktop. Tonight's presentation is part of our series on preparing for the next generation science standards, and tonight's focus is on the practice of obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. Our presenters this evening are Philip Bell, Leah Bricker, and Katie Van Horne. We also have Ted Willard from NSTA online with us. My name is Bryn Slate. I'll be moderating this evening, and Jeff Lehman is available to provide technical support. I just remind everyone that the NSTA Learning Center is available online, your EPD portal, for over 10,000 resources for science educators, of which over 3,500 of them are free. You can add them to your library to access when it's convenient for you. Our community forums are there for you to discuss educational issues with other teachers, and our online advisors are ready to help you find the information that you need there in the Learning Center. You can also check out our free tools to organize your professional learning and meet your goals. And it's all available by going to learningcenter.nsta.org. And now I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Ted Willard, NSTA's Director of Efforts around the Next Generation Science Standards. Welcome, Ted.
Thanks, Bryn, and thanks everyone for being here. I particularly want to thank all of you who've been here for all 8 of these web seminars. Back when I first started lining up speakers for all of these things, December 19th seemed forever in the future, and now we're suddenly here. As we'll point out later in at the end of the hour, this isn't over. We're going to be doing some more pieces around the practices and other aspects of the Next Generation Science Standards come in after the first of the year, and we all know we're looking forward to the standards themselves coming out in 2013. So to give you a quick run through here of the different elements that we're working with here, the standards themselves involve 4 organizations: the National Academies, Achieve, NSTA, and AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And this process has basically a sort of a 2 to 3 step process, depending on how you look at it. The first was the release of the framework back in 2011. We now have the standards being worked on, and the standards will be used to develop assessment, curricula, instruction, and teacher professional development, all of which will eventually be fitting into and influencing what learning goes on for students. The process that's been being used here started in the first public draft was this past May, and we now are at the stage of knowing that very soon after the first of the year we'll be getting a copy of the next public draft. The goal still is to have the final version of standards out by the end of the first quarter. So, and I've heard the date March 31st is still the first quarter. We'll get there. We'll get that document, I'm told, by that date. So the main piece here is the framework itself. That's what it's been our guidance in terms of talking about the practices themselves through this whole series. I mentioned it was developed by the National Academies of Sciences, and they had a committee that involved scientists and science educators. Tonight, one of tonight's speakers, Phil Bell, was actually one of the members of the committee, so another opportunity to hear from someone who was on the committee, just as we did with the first seminar when we had Brian Reiser on. If you haven't looked at the framework, I really encourage you to get a copy and to read it. You can get a free PDF from the National Academies Press at their website, or you can order a print copy via NSTA Press, the Science Store, and get your membership discount. So there's 3 dimensions that this framework has. The first of these, the one we're focusing on in this whole series, is the scientific and engineering practices. For those of you who attended some of these previous web seminars, you've seen these elements, and tonight we're going to be obviously talking about the 8th practice in this list, although not necessarily the 8th in how it's used. There also are cross-cutting concepts, these ideas of themes that cut across all the various science disciplines. And we have the core ideas themselves, the elements in life science, physical science, earth and space science, and in some ways new here, engineering technology being treated as an equal partner in this whole set. Here's an example of a performance expectation that gives you a sense of how these different elements all fit together. We've got this statement here, a performance expectation that says, construct and use models to explain that atoms combine to form new substances of varying complexity in terms of the number of atoms and repeating subunits. So that pulls together a practice, specifically this idea of developing and using models. It incorporates a core disciplinary idea, the idea that atoms combine to form new substances, and patterns comes up in this as well because we have this aspect of repeating subunits. So if you had a block of iron, how the iron, individual iron atom is repeated and repeated through the material, or ice, H2O, the unit in this case would be a water molecule, and how that repeats again. Now all of these elements here in the performance expectation, this is a description of what is to be assessed at the end of instruction. It's not specifically that this is the only way to help students understand this idea. While you would have students constructing these models, you would also have them, let's say, obtain information using the practice that we use tonight, or asking questions about atoms and molecules. Every practice, it comes into play here in learning every idea. With that setup and foundation to work with, I want to turn things over to Phil, Katie, and Leah. Really happy to have the three of them here to share what they know about this practice.
Thanks, Ted. This is Phil Bell, and we're going to do introductions in just a minute. I wanted to welcome everyone to this last webinar of the fall on the 8th practice in the framework, and we'll spend the next 75 minutes or so giving an overview of the practice itself, and then some equity-related dimensions of it, and then we'll give some examples. With that, I just want to thank you for the invitation, Ted and Bryn, to come and present today and to think with people about how to be supporting this practice out in the lives of learners. So as we get started, we're going to advance here. Working on it. Excellent. Very good. So I am Phil Bell. I'm faculty in the Learning Sciences and Human Development program here at the University of Washington. And as Ted mentioned, I did serve on the NRC committee that drafted the framework vision for K-12 science education. And I'm happy to talk about that in particular as well. And with that, I'll turn it over to Leah to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leah Bricker. I'm an assistant professor of science education at the University of Michigan, and I want to echo what Phil said. I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Ted, Bryn, and NSTA for providing us with this opportunity. Katie.
Hi, I'm Katie Van Horne. I'm a graduate researcher in the learning sciences at the University of Washington.
All right, so just to give you a bit of an overview of the program for tonight, we'll do some kind of definition framing work around the practice. We'll then talk a little bit about a design idea we kind of implement and that others do as well, where you think about how the practices interrelate to each other and are supportive of investigations. We call that a cascade of practices kind of approach. We'll give an overview of how the practices relate to educational equity, social justice issues in science education, and try to dial that into specific dimensions of this practice and have some broader points. We then have 4 examples to share with you from high school, middle school, 5th grade, and then actually pre-K, where this practice has been supported with learners, and will give you a very kind of concrete idea of how that can work at those different grade bands, and how it shows up in different subject matter areas. And then we'll kind of wrap up by framing some challenges and opportunities around the practice. One thing that we'll point you to right at the tail end of the talk tonight is a resource collection that we've brought together, 40 different resources that kind of relate to the practice or the framework more generally, and we'll point you to that right at the tail end. So a lot of the things that we'll reference throughout the talk, actually, you'll be able to find in that resource collection and get access to, so you don't have to spend your time scribbling them down or anything.
Okay, to start off with a quote from the framework. This practice, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. Being literate in science and engineering requires the ability to read and understand their literatures. Science and engineering are all ways of knowing that are represented and communicated by words, diagrams, charts, graphs, images, symbols, and mathematics. Reading and interpreting and producing text are fundamental practices of science in particular, and they constitute at least half of engineers and scientists' total working time. So to reiterate, text here is used to refer to any form of communication, from printed text and written text to video productions. In our examples today, we'll showcase multiple different ways that text is produced by students as they're working through their learning and investigation. And a high-level summary of this is to say that substantial acts of reading, writing, and otherwise communicating should be embedded in student science and engineering investigations. As described in the framework, this supports important cognitive and social learning processes. It helps accomplish the ambitious learning goals outlined in the framework, and it also allows related learning goals to be focused on, for example, those outlined in the Common Core State Standards in Mathematics and the ELA Science and Technology. So we've posted our article that is referenced here in the resource collection we'll share later. And we're also happy to talk about how this practice relates to the Common Core ELA Science and Tech Standards and the rubrics associated with that.
I do want to point out that what we're hoping to how to interact with everyone tonight. If you have questions as we are talking, please feel free to type those in the chat so that we are collecting those, and when we get to specific spaces where we'll stop our presentation so that we can interact with your questions, we'll have a better sense of what people have been asking all along. So go ahead and type questions anytime you have them into the chat. That'll help us then interact with them once we get to stopping spaces. So this slide, what we want to do here is, given what Katie said, kind of the large overview of the practice from the framework, these are just different examples of what fall under this practice. It's a very large practice, and it encompasses many of the other practices, which Phil will talk about here in a bit. Because we're always communicating our ideas, and in science and in engineering, our communication is multimodal. It's not just the written word, it's not just the spoken word, it's also a lot of representations like graphs and diagrams and tables, equations and symbols. So we want to bring students K through 12 and beyond into all of these different ways of communicating. And then we also have ways that we obtain information in the first place and evaluate the reliability and the validity of the information that we're obtaining. So I think that this practice is very important for understanding, for students to understand how scientists and engineers really do their work, because as Katie said, and this is research referenced in the framework, turns out over 50% of scientists and engineers' jobs involve interacting with text, producing it, using it in some way, shape, or form. And so in schools, if we're relying on our English language arts colleagues to always bring students into this practice, I think it's a missed opportunity to give them a better sense of what scientists and engineers do day to day. And it's also a very important skill for everyday life. As we well know, these kinds of skills will serve students well no matter what they decide to do. And just be able to interact with science that impacts us so heavily, such as our health and those kinds of issues. So what we've done on this slide is break out the different pieces of the practice: reading, interpreting, and producing text in terms of written communication. And as we talked about, our texts in science and engineering are multimodal. But we also want to give kids a lot of opportunity to communicate via their verbalization. So bring them into practices associated with different conference presentations, certainly be able to facilitate discussions in class, giving students opportunities to possibly teach others. As I talked about, we want to be able to give them practice and lots of opportunities with critically being consumers of science and engineering products. And what are tools and strategies that you can use to find this information when you need it? And then how do you actually, as we talked about, critically consume it in terms of evaluating it? And so this is what we've attempted to do, and we'll show you this in our examples a little bit later on. We try and bring students in to reading and comprehending a variety of textual forms, from peer-reviewed journal articles that in many cases we are adapting for classroom use, popular science magazine articles and newspaper articles, and obviously textbook readings. We also want to help them with their production of text. Again, text being interpreted very broadly here. So in order to do that, how do we help students recognize major features of science and engineering related writing and speaking? Sentence structure can be very complicated, as we all know, technical vocabulary as well. Generalized academic vocabulary, such as what does analysis mean, what are models, those kinds of things. And then certainly expository text tends to have very logical flows to it. So how do we help students recognize all of this so that they're able to produce it? Again, this multimodal idea that science and engineering communication features a lot of different forms. So again, how do we bring students into this? And we've talked about helping them to evaluate the reliability and validity of sources and claims and data in the text that they're reading.
All right, so how is it that actually scientists communicate? Can we use kind of our understanding of scientific communication as somewhat of a model to think about science learners? This is a particular diagram that comes from Bruce Lewinstein at Cornell University. He's a science and technology scholar who studies science communication, science media. And this is a classical model of people conducting research in the lab or field, going through particular processes to produce formal papers, and then communicating those more broadly to mass media, textbooks, and policy. Well, it turns out that was a pretty good model for a while, or maybe. It at least was pretty much a fit for how people thought about the work. Bruce and colleagues have been thinking about how information actually flows throughout the scientific community, given the dramatic shifts that we've seen as a result of information technologies. So in this diagram, you see kind of a more accurate information flow diagram about how scientists communicate and receive information related to their work. And so just generally the point is to think about that things have changed pretty dramatically given information communication technologies that are now so deeply pervasive in society. So with that as an image, we can think about more generally what the implications are for science education in different ways. This is a diagram that just shows for a Web 2.0 kind of approach for thinking about how the internet supports certain kinds of interaction and media exchange. There are different trends and technologies that are now broadly available to us, like the infrastructure for this webinar that 10 years ago would be very hard to pull off. So we can engage in this kind of knowledge sharing quite uniquely. So, one thing to be thinking about, and we're trying to model this transition tonight as we're engaging in our presentation, it's just, how is it that we as professionals are making use of social media and digital media to support our learning? And so how do you obtain, evaluate, and communicate information related to your work? And do you make deep use of it or not? And if so, how are you doing that? We thought that might be a fun topic for you to feed ideas or strategies into the chat window if there are certain things that you productively do use to stay informed and to keep refining your practice. So with that, we're going to go to one last framing point, which is really kind of an overarching goal for the framework and the next generation science standards, which is given the kind of education system that we have in this country, very distributed, not so tightly linked, there's an idea that the vision in the framework and the standards can help promote coherence in important ways. One thing that I think is new about how the framework and the Common Core math standards in particular are approaching kind of our image of learning is that it's a developmental image, that we're trying to support students in longer-term engagements and supports across multiple grades around core ideas, around making connections to cross-cutting concepts, to engaging in deep deeper and deeper forms of the practices. That gets talked about in the framework as developmental coherence. So how do we develop this shared understanding across grade levels of what students come to know over K-12, even pre-K-12 and beyond? So how do we just think about the idea that learning takes effort and it takes significant periods of time, and so we need to work to actually coordinate our supports across grade bands in ways that are kind of called out in the vision. That involves getting educators and curriculum developers and assessment specialists to do coordination across grade bands in ways that we haven't historically done as well. And so there's new opportunities to think about how do you support the communication practice that we'll talk about tonight across pre-K-12 so that we can, within our particular systems, have students come deeper and deeper into the practice. So I'm going to transition now and talk a little bit about the design strategy because the practices don't live in isolation by themselves. We talk about this as a cascade of practices design approach, and I'm going to start off by just reminding us of the list of practices that Ted already shared with us. So these 8 practices were the set that we ended up putting into the vision document, into the framework, highlighting, you know, one of the 3 dimensions that we wanted to kind of have in play around how to approach learning. The framework for each of these 8 talk about the learning goals where students end up by the end of 12th grade. So you can kind of think about the qualities of the practices in terms of how students engage in them that we ultimately want to get to. And then part of what is going to be happening over the next decade is that research will be ongoing to try to figure out how students develop their understanding across these longer time periods, which is something we really don't have as much research on at this point. The idea of cascading practices is that if these 8 practices are how we're now defining inquiry, which is a productive way to think about them, students should have significant experience actually engaging in sustained investigations that involve these practices as they produce knowledge about the natural world or about the built world from the engineering point of view. So we want to engage them in these practices in deeper and deeper ways while they learn about disciplinary core ideas that are embedded in the practices, and then make connections to the cross-cutting concepts as they go. So these practices are not, it's not something where you would design a unit that's about one practice. It's more that these practices actually overlap and interrelate in important ways. The way that we talk about it in our design work at the curriculum level and at the instructional level is really about this cascade of how do you overlap them and unfold them so that you can support students in conducting an authentic investigation or design project over a stretch of time. We often design curriculum units in kind of 5 to 7 week chunks, which allow you to kind of have students engage in a series of the practices in this overlapping kind of way. So in the example, students might start by learning about particular natural science phenomena or ideas and developing a testable scientific question about that particular topic. You might engage in the 3rd practice of then designing a study and then collecting data related to that question that they've posed that's testable and is something that they're able to kind of pull off. They might move on to then, in practice 4, having collected their data, analyzing and interpreting that data set, and then developing a model from that data analysis as a practice 2 kind of component, and then culminating in some representation or communication of that model and those findings to an audience that they can share their knowledge with. And so you see kind of this cascade of different practices coming together and supporting the students and pulling off kind of a multifaceted investigation. All right, so we're going to do one more section, then we'll open up for our first Q&A. So be thinking about ideas and questions or comments that you want to share and posting those in chat, and we'll be kind of going through and pulling them out to have a discussion in just a moment. We wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the equity dimensions of this transition to practices. There's actually a lot of opportunity in this transition to practices to promote social justice and educational equity, and it's a dimension of the discussion that we think is worth really thinking into. And there's a growing conversation about how to think about this. Obviously, equity in education generally and in science ed in particular is an ongoing struggle. In the framework, we framed it using this particular quote, and I kind of want to read it to get it on the table, then I'll talk about it a little bit relative to the practice. So, equity in science education requires that all students are provided with equitable opportunities to learn science and become engaged in science and engineering practices, with access to quality space, equipment, and teachers to support and motivate that learning and engagement, and adequate time spent on science. In addition, the issue of connecting to students' interests and experiences is particularly important for broadening participation in science to kind of expand the range of individuals who are connecting and learning science. So, obviously there are very complicated, profound issues, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. In terms of kind of accessing and evaluating, communicating information, there are some specific issues that come up. Time to actually engage in the practice and opportunities to engage in that work, and we can talk about the struggles of elementary school science at this particular moment, given competing instructional topics that are in play. We can talk about access to information technologies in some of our school settings where it's very challenging to actually engage in the kind of information resources gathering that you might want. We can talk about the defunding of libraries within schools and how it's hard to buy materials that relate to science topics often. We also talk about how mobile phones can be a strategy. Actually, in terms of learning technologies, there's a growing number of individuals looking at mobile phones as an equity strategy, since they're much more pervasive than larger machines. And we can talk about the district policy issues attached, or school or policy issues related to use of mobile phones for instruction. So it gives you a bit of a sense of how the equity issues relate to the practice. Generally, the practice is a productive equity move if it can support the equity and social justice goals if there are efforts to do a set of specific things. So practices actually do engage students in an active social cognitive learning process that's very powerful. And if you can get practices in play, we know that the research literature shows us that it's a very productive learning strategy to focus on the practice. The practice can actually also be focused on learner interest, everyday language, knowledge, the practices that students engage in outside of school, and the identities that are in development for them. And so that kind of asset-based view is a very constructive thing that you can build on as things go forward. The focus on practice also helps us to expand what gets counted as science. We see a set of different things being done here to broaden the range of topics that are in play. I think the design engineering part of the framework is emblematic of that, but a lot of local communities also have very relevant knowledge about the natural world that can be related through a practice and brought in through a practice. And generally, connecting the information practice to the everyday lives of the youth and communities is generally a productive strategy to make it into a very authentic, grounded, relevant activity for students. I wondered if people are interested in a little bit more about kind of the broader frame about learning kind of in and out of school within diverse communities. The three of us are part of a National Science Foundation funded center called the Life Center, where we look at learning in informal and formal environments. A few years ago, we drafted a consensus report about learning across settings within diverse communities. Obviously, if you're born within particular racial majority groups that have a lot of assets, you're in a very different place in terms of being able to engage in educational experiences than if you're in a group that's been historically marginalized or have low resources to draw upon. There are a set of concepts and principles developed in this volume which help think about different aspects of the situation and how to promote progress. Specifically related to science education, the framework talks about how there are very particular persistent learning gaps and differences in achievement related to science. For a host of complex reasons, the framework ended up talking a lot about two particular ones: equalizing opportunities to learn, and then how to make science instruction more inclusive for all students. So I'll say a little bit more about these as we go in. One thing that can come up, though, when you talk about the ambitious learning goals in the framework is, are these learning goals for all students really? Can all students aspire to these outcomes? And the research base is clear that human learning of this kind actually can be supported, and that with a small number of notable exceptions, everyone can engage in learning complex subject matter, especially if it connects to areas of personal interest and consequence when supportive conditions are in place. And so we kind of draw on the set of studies that have shown dramatic learning effects in very complicated social circumstances to show that this really is possible if we allocate resources and time in the right way. So we spend a lot of time in the framework talking about inclusive science instruction that I'll just kind of characterize aspects of what's in that chapter. The leading idea is that science and science understanding should grow out of the lived experiences of learners. This is a kind of a cultural perspective on learning move to say, how can this science topic relate to your life history and who you want to become, or what you already know from your out-of-school experience or previous time in school. So that particular kind of move to build on what learners bring to the moment allows for the distinction between school and non-school to be productively blurred. Science is a very rich human enterprise, and we sometimes give students kind of versions of science that are too cleaned up relative to how scientists actually work. Scientists often, as they theorize, talk in anthropomorphic ways. They often have affective feelings about their specimens. They're people conducting their work, and they do it in systematic ways, but it's often a little bit more textured than we often highlight to students. So there's a way to kind of think about broadening our image of what scientists do. At the same time, we can broaden the topics that are relevant and the knowledge that is brought to bear to topics. Another dimension of inclusive science instruction is really providing learner choice to the degree possible, and to actually allow them to make meaningful personal connections to what's being learned, and often connecting it into the broader interests of the community. So around the obtaining, evaluating, communicating information practice, we talk about in the equity chapter to encourage and value multiple modes of expression. That is very salient to this practice, that there are a broad variety of ways that through verbal discourse or through written forms, students can be expressing their understanding at different levels of formality. We also talked about that recognizing that language and discourse patterns vary across culturally diverse groups. Researchers point to the importance of accepting, even encouraging students, classroom use of informal or native language, first language, and other familiar modes of interaction. So there's very powerful work, and we've posted a set of resources that highlight how this can happen in instruction to really leverage the ways of talking, the ways of making sense of the natural world that students bring to the science classroom, and then helping them understand how science does that same kind of work as well. So there is a very good bridging to students' forms of expression that can happen. And also, this practice is actually quite unique, I think, in some ways, because it allows kind of more directly for students to actually work on social justice purposes, especially for those from non-dominant communities. You can actually use this communication of scientific information practice to engage with problems or topics that are relevant to them personally or for their community. That could be around food, nutrition, and water quality at school, or health hazards within their community, which we know show up more often within non-dominant communities, or a range of other global issues that students want to engage in. And so expressing a perspective or information related to those issues is directly related to the practice. And so to wrap up, I'll just kind of highlight that the framework talks about science learning being a cultural accomplishment as much as it is a cognitive accomplishment, and we kind of talk about the benefits of that. We talk about relating youth discourses to the scientific discourses that show up within disciplines. We highlight the productivity of building up higher interest and identity, and you'll see examples of that in just a moment. And then we talk about leveraging these deeper cultural funds of knowledge that reside within communities to connect it into the student's learning experience in the classroom. A few resources that relate to inclusive instruction, and these are posted in that resource collection that we'll share with you a little bit later, but they go into a lot more detail about how it looks kind of at the classroom level to engage in this work. turn it over to Brent.
Thank you, Phil. And at this point, folks, we are going to move into our first question and discussion break. But before we get to that, I'd like to remind you that you can turn off the notifications of others arriving by going to Edit, Preferences, then General and Visual Notifications. If you're on a Mac, you'll go to Blackboard Collaborate instead of Edit, and then follow the rest of the steps. I'll also remind you that you can change the size of your chat panel simply by using the arrows on the left or right side to minimize or to detach and expand. I'll also remind you that you can continue the discussion there in the NSTA Learning Center Community Forums. Link is now in the chat window. If you have any questions about logistics, feel free to double-click on my name there in the participants window to send me a private chat message. And at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ted Willard to bring back some of our great questions that have been submitted.
Yeah, thanks, Bryn. As we go through here, first one I see to touch base on from Lisa. She brings up this aspect, you said we're discussing inclusive instruction, and you had a point where you mentioned, allow the distinction between science and non-science to be blurred. And her question was, were you talking specifically about science and non-science, or school and non-school, or maybe some combination of both?
Yeah, so I probably wasn't quite as precise as I needed to be in that moment. It's almost, it's what's taken to be science and non-science that is being blurred. So if you look at the work that goes on within the sciences, there's a broader variety of things that are present there that we don't always take into account when we design curriculum or instruction for students. And so I think you see things like, the deep interplay of science and engineering, for example, being, that kind of hand-in-glove relationship between doing empirical investigations of the world and theorizing in relation to design and broader development of technologies, and that kind of back and forth. That's one kind of clear example. I think there's another example of that is often kind of an unintentional thing where we don't recognize the knowledge about the natural world that particular communities hold, when the research base shows us that historically communities have developed very relevant knowledge about the natural world through in relation to their personal interests and practices. And so, a very clear example of that, for example, would be around indigenous communities. We're doing kind of work within a particular community where you can actually leverage the knowledge base of the community much more deeply and strategically and relate it to the learning goals of the science classroom than has historically been the case. And I think that that's a good leading example of this deeper blurring of what's often counted as science versus counted as non-science.
Great. I think sort of building on this, Elizabeth Scott has a question here about the gap, at least the apparent gap sometimes, between what learners are interested in and what we are trying to get them to understand. And maybe some of you can comment on, how, building on what you just mentioned there with the indigenous populations, or in another example of how you find those connections to work through.
So I'll foreshadow a little bit, and I'll invite my colleagues to chime in as well. The upper elementary school example, I think, is a really nice approach to take central ideas of science that relate to microbiology and then relate it to dozens of practices that are present in the community, and to give students choice to kind of learn about those disciplinary ideas in the context of different practices, and we'll talk about instructionally how we do that. I do think, there can be tensions between learner choice and standards, although we're, mounting a set of different efforts where we're doing a version of the inclusive science instruction, highlighting learner interest and choice, where we're trying to build it into the project work for the students. And in some ways, you're able to kind of allow an aspect of the students' longer-term history and interest to find its way into the project work. In other ways, you're helping them actually develop new interests that they didn't know about, right? To say, well, scientists actually do this kind of work, as well. And so you're kind of doing the interest-driven learning move in the context of the project work while still relating it to the learning goals in the standards. So, it's not an end-all, it's not a perfect situation, but I do think that there's a fair amount of opportunity to do that kind of work, and I wonder if my colleagues want to chime in.
I think, as Phil talked about, several of our examples show some of this, so maybe we can wait until we get to the examples, and then if people still have questions or the examples generate more questions, then we can keep talking about this. Excuse me.
No, I think that sounds like a great idea. We can move on through some of your examples here. I'll just note, I think it's just an interesting point for me just to observe is Julie's comment about that it's very hard to find, we live in such a diverse society, at least that's how I'm interpreting her comment, that's very hard to find in a whole classroom that there's common knowledge across all the students in the room. And so we'll work on through some examples and then have some more question breaks. And as always, you guys can put in some questions in the chat room as we're going along here.
Okay, thanks, Ted. We're going to go ahead and move on, as you said, to some examples. We're going to start at the high school level for a couple of different reasons. First of all, we want to make the point that the types of skill that one needs to bring to bear when obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information is kind of a lifelong skill, and we have to continue to learn about it, not just high school, but beyond as well. And so we thought we would show you some examples using some curriculum work that we've been developing now with colleagues and teacher collaborators that kind of highlight some of how we've been bringing students into these very specific practices. And we'd love to hear, since these are simply the examples we've been working with, we'd love to hear examples that you have as well and that you want to share. And again, like we've been talking about, hopefully this will make some aspects of Phil's equity points clearer in terms of how we've chosen to weave some of that in. Okay, so the first example that I want to talk about, this is part of a much larger unit about genetics that we've been building and testing for the last couple of years. So students are learning about lots of different core ideas and common themes related to genetics, everything from DNA structure and function through mitosis, meiosis, and then transcription, translation, inheritance, just all of those different ideas that are embedded underneath these topics. But at the same time, students are conducting a DNA barcoding project. So this project is running parallel to a lot of the instruction that they're working on at the same time. This project idea, there's a group in New York City. It's called the Urban Barcode Project, and we've been working with them and able to follow along what their high school students have been doing. But basically in this project that we've developed for students, they're writing a research design plan, right? So this speaks to the idea of cascade of practices Phil was talking about. They're posing in this research design plan a testable question: what do they want to barcode and why? I'll show you some of those questions in a moment. They're collecting samples and extracting and amplifying and sequencing DNA from those samples, so that's a whole big version of data collection. They're analyzing those data, which I'll talk more about here in a moment, and then they're writing a scientific abstract and giving presentations to a larger audience about their results. DNA barcoding is a way to look at and identify different species, and so scientists are using this to identify within any given area different species that are within that area, so to do work related to biodiversity. The FDA and others are also using this as a way to identify fraud. So for example, if you're at a sushi restaurant and eating sushi, are you really eating the fish that is identified on the menu? And it's also a way to just identify species, period. So for example, if you have spiders in your home, what kind of spiders are they? So you can use DNA barcoding to do all of that kind of work. So here's some examples of some of the students' projects that the students who have been so kind to help us have been working on. What species of bird feathers are found in cages at the local pet store? You can dig in the shaft of feathers and get DNA and use that for barcoding. Which species of shark or fish are being sold at local markets? What organisms are in imitation crab meat and can they be harmful to us? So again, this is just examples of how we've worked in choice in terms of what students are interested within a structured project, but what they're interested in investigating within their own communities. So in terms of obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information, one of the things that we do in this unit is to have students interact with an actual scientific abstract that students in the Urban Barcode Project in New York City wrote and got published in Nature. So these students at the high school level, these were high school students that wrote this paper. They barcoded various, all different types of tea that they found all around New York City in local markets, in more commercialized grocery stores. And in that abstract, let's see if I can get this pointer to work. The students found that about a third of herbal teas generated DNA identifications not found on the labels. And so that was one of their big findings. So to bring students into our students, once they're at the point where they're ready to, they've done their research and they're ready to write their abstract, we engage them with this particular abstract to show them what an example looks like. And we try and go a little bit further using some of Kim Gomez and colleagues' annotation techniques that we know are very helpful to bring students into an understanding of technical vocabulary that can be quite dense and at times incomprehensible. So the first thing that we have students do is to go through this abstract and triangle, as you can see by this red triangle here, triangle any words that are very unfamiliar to them so that we can have discussions with them about what these words might mean. You can see that some of them are words that might be unfamiliar to them. Some, like this, are very much scientific, technical jargon that we want to make sure that they understand. Then what we do is, continuing with the annotation, we're also making sure that they understand when you go to write an abstract, what do these different pieces look like? How do scientists actually structurally construct this type of writing? So again, in the sciences and in engineering, it's not necessarily narrative writing, it's expository text. So we're looking to make sure that students know how to write this kind of text and be able to explain their ideas, be able to define their ideas, be able to do that kind of writing, which is very different than narrative writing. And so how to help them think about how to do that, we have them annotate this particular, again, this sample abstract from the students in New York City so that we can bring out different pieces of this, such as those students' research questions, their rationale for doing the barcoding, the implications of their work as they see it. And so we give our students this model of actually how you could write this and what the different components are. And again, even at the high school level, because so many students have never had the opportunity to write this type of text before, we actually provide sentence starters for those students who are feeling like they need this kind of support. You know, just these different sentence starters, you can read these here. You know, our barcoding research question was, our findings indicate, the evidence that we use to support our findings is, and just to help them get a better sense of how they might construct this, what kinds of language they might use to construct this abstract. And then they don't simply just produce the abstract because, and then they're finished. So when they've written a rough draft, they receive peer feedback from their teachers. And we've also been working with many different people involved in genetics research. And so students get expert feedback as well from someone who's not a teacher, from someone who is a geneticist or working in a genetics-related field. So those people are giving them feedback on their abstract that then they revise and ultimately that they publish. So this is one example of how we've been bringing students into this practice.
Thank you, Leah. The second example I'm going to talk about comes from the high school biology unit in the same project that Leah just described, so there's some of the same features. Students are writing an research design plan in this one as well. And in this unit, it's a unit about infectious disease. They're learning the underlying biological concepts of how diseases manifest within humans or animals or viruses or bacteria. And then we asked students to think about it more at a macro level, and they used social network analysis surveys and tools to study how a disease spread through their community. So some research questions that students asked were, how do physical contact networks and online social networks compare? And can understanding an online social network be useful for disease prediction and prevention? How does the social network of our school affect the spread of influenza during an outbreak? How do connections between different people inside a school environment affect the spread of flu or the common cold? So very similar to the barcoding project that Leah just described, before students even decide on which project they will work on, they have to read, find information, listen to videos and online media related to social network analysis and its application to disease spread. In this example, we'll show how students use different representations of the data they collected in their project and in their investigations, both social network analysis diagrams and then graphed survey results, in coordination with written text to develop claims related to their research questions. So this particular group that I'm going to highlight, students asked, how do connections between different people inside a school environment affect the spread of the flu or the common cold? And they used SurveyMonkey to collect social network information and health behavior information from their peers in school. And they were instructed to annotate their data representations to support their claim. Their claim in this case was, depending where the virus started, changed how fast the virus moved through the community of entire connections of students. So on the, I'm forgetting to change the slide, sorry. On the screen here you can see small representations of the data that they collected. And I'll talk through each different type. So in this first piece of data, the student showed how the separation of this particular network could affect disease spread by annotating the different red and blue circles. So in the red circle, they showed how the red circle first was not connected to the blue circle, and therefore that may have something to do with disease spread in this particular social network. And in the blue circle, they described this concept of herd immunity and how the importance of vaccinating people in more central locations in this highly populated network could potentially affect disease spread. So that's what they described here in the blue circle with this text. So they were taking their data analysis and then using text to describe it to help support their claim. And in this next slide, the students also analyzed and annotated their survey data, and they used a free version of SurveyMonkey, which is why it says sample across it. But it was still very effective, and in this question, the question they asked their peers for this particular piece of data was, have you taken your flu shot this year? And then they related this information, which they got back, which was that over 50% of the students did not have flu shots, that's the big blue section, to the information from the previous graph, in this graph, to say that this would have a high impact if 50% of those people that weren't vaccinated were then in the central blue network. So these students were taking their text and representations and linking them with their claims and the data in this way. And they then did something similar to what Leah said, which was they presented their information to their peers in full class presentations. They also wrote abstracts and elevator speeches and shared those with their peers, teachers, and infectious disease experts to get feedback on their claims and representations as well. So across both examples, we see multiple aspects of the practice in play. Students are reading and comprehending different textual forms. They're recognizing major features of science and engineering writing, and they're using those features in their science communication that they're producing to communicate with their peers, with experts, with their teachers. For example, the abstracts, or they're explaining representations with written text.
All right, so we're going to move on to a middle school example. I do want to, I was following the chat stream, and I wanted to kind of say a couple of quick things. So that set of high school examples actually are coming from a project funded by the Gates Foundation to try to imagine how to bring an ambitious instructional model out to low-income schools specifically. So those are taking place in a set of schools, often kind of high-poverty schools that we're doing that work to try to figure out how do you actually shift the learning circumstances pretty dramatically within those settings. So it's an ambitious growing effort. We're trying to figure out how to kind of bring it to broader scale, and we'll say more about it. We linked some resources related to that and the rubrics that are used in the online resource space, so you can kind of see a little bit more of how we're kind of approaching it. This particular middle school example is from a little while ago. In the 90s, we were funded to try to think about how the internet had a role to play in science classrooms. This was right around 1994 or so when we started this work. This particular work then came about five years later. And it's really about evaluating and arguing with evidence through a classroom debate approach. So I'll kind of give an example of how different practices come into play, including the information practice in relation to explanation and argumentation. It's an 8th grade physical science classroom. This particular debate project, called How Far Does Light Go, is at the culmination of about 4 or 5 weeks of lab work that students are doing on understanding the nature of light, and doing a series of different experiments about light. And this is really kind of the synthesis activity that brings together the unit. It's framed around, we frame this debate for the students around 2 ideas: that light dies out as you move farther away from a light source, which is an intuitive theory that a lot of students have as the phenomena, that you experience, that it goes away, versus the more scientific normative theory, light goes forever until absorbed. So we kind of frame this in these 2 broad theoretical ideas, and then students, over the course of about 8 days, engage in a series of activities. They search out evidence related to the claim, the debate. They create new pieces. They evaluate these sources of information and these pieces of data, and they start categorizing it in a way that I'll show you in a moment. They develop written arguments that include embedded causal explanations of evidence. And really, the idea is that we're trying to help them actually write a 2 to 4 page argument where they're persuading others about kind of how they've come to think about one theory or the other theory being correct. And they get ready for rebuttals, and they try to think through this argumentation approach to making sense of the information and the theory. They then actually culminate with 2 days of classroom debate where they share their ideas and they push hard on each other's thinking and do their work together to learn more about light. The students are, constructing these evidence-based explanations in these longer arguments that they're developing. It is, I know in other webinars, there's been discussion of the claim evidence reasoning framework to support argumentation, and that is a very relative, parallel kind of approach to what's described here. The evidence that was built into this particular unit came from a variety of sources on purpose to try to think about how to make sense of classroom lab work in relation to online media, random websites, and other life experiences that the students engaged in, to have them develop an integrated understanding of light across a variety of different kinds of information. Here we see some images that are evocative of the broader set of things that students were working on. We were funded to use technology in the science classroom, so we were developing a suite of different tools to support students in a learning process. This is the SenseMaker argument mapping tool that I created to help students really map their arguments visually and to embed their explanations within it. So I will say, although it's a technology project, we had a follow-on project that actually was a paper-based version of the same effort, where we used stickies and kind of low-tech approaches to do parallel knowledge work with the kids. So there are kind of more cost-effective, simpler ways to engage in the same work. Students are thinking about the pieces of information that are the blue dots shown here in the diagram, and they're trying to relate them to the boxes, which are the claim frames that are kind of related to the debate topic. They're actually making use of a particular tool that is showing up within the experience as well, where they get supported to develop these causal explanations about the evidence that's in play. So here you see a particular set of prompts that the students have filled out, and they've actually produced an explanation that connects a piece of evidence to the debate topic in a very specific way, and they describe their causal thinking about how light is related to that evidence. And then they're kind of doing that across the entire set, about 15 different pieces. They produce the 2 to 4 page version by working with each piece individually. What they end up creating is a visual argument at the high level where they've categorized evidence, they've ranked its relevance to the debate, and they start to put it into other conceptual frames that they think relate to the theory. So every student pair ends up creating a kind of a unique argument map of this particular kind. The argument maps then actually become really the leading focus of the debate discussions as students present in front of the class and present their argument. Students in the audience can compare their argument map to that of the group presenting easily in a way that highlights that students were thinking about the evidence differently, very specific pieces. And so you might have categorized my favorite piece of evidence as not being relevant to the debate at all, so it opens up a line of discussion, as I'll show you in a moment. Or particular ideas of the students are made visible through how they end up building out claims within the argument map. So it's a way of making student thinking visible through a social process where you can keep refining it over time. Here's a bit of transcript to kind of pull it into focus at the classroom level. So you have student 1 in the audience asking the presenting pair, why did you put the soccer field, which is a piece of evidence, in irrelevant? The student presenting, student 2, then says, I put soccer field in irrelevant because, because it was the one with the flashlight and they held the light back, and then the light from the car, like headlights, it went out further, so I don't really think it really made that much of a difference, or I didn't really supported either theory because it did go a long way. The light intensity wasn't as strong. So trying to reconstruct the evidence while trying to mount an argument. Student 3, also from the audience, says, well, for the soccer field, doesn't that kind of prove how far light keeps going if it keeps showing as the guy is moving back and the light gets stopped like a reflection, or light would stop that light because da-da-da. And then student 2 kind of pulls it together and says, well, I don't really think it supports either theory because I know that the light is still there and it's being absorbed and it's spreading out so much that you can't see it, but the light energy is still there. So here you see kind of, I think, a very real episode of students grappling with pretty complicated ideas and evidence to try to think about how to kind of make sense of it. And so, it opened up because the presenting pair had put a piece of evidence under irrelevant, but then as they opened up their thinking, they actually had quite a bit of sophisticated thought about that piece of evidence that then got on the table. And so it kind of shows that, over 2 days of sense-making, the group can pull together different aspects of their understanding of light around the corpus of evidence and the ideas that are in play within the debate. So aspects of the practice that are in play here, I think it's very productive to view classrooms as scientific communities writ small, to engage students in this collaborative process where they do their investigation, maybe in a small group. They then share their knowledge with each other. They try to fit it together. They try to seek consensus in how they see patterns in the data and the ideas that are explanatory of the data collected. Here we also see a kind of a cascade of practices playing out. So you see data collection moments in earlier labs feeding into the evaluation of online information in a criteria-based way. I'll talk about more in a moment. And then students developing causal explanations of that evidence, and then engaging in argument construction and debate around their ideas. And the research studies show that engaging students in this kind of learning process is very supportive of their conceptual learning of the subject matter. So students use it as a platform to really make sense of the conceptual ideas related to the topic. The scaffolding of the online information, we had a set of particular criteria in play to help students take up kind of a science-focused way of understanding online information related to science. So we talked about the fit of the information to scientific knowledge, or kind of knowledge base more generally. We talked about appropriate scientific methods for producing knowledge within that information, the trustworthiness of the source, the relevance to the debate topic itself or the task, to get students to think about how things fit in the online space and in their classroom experiences to this particular debate moment. And the debate itself actually leverages social and cognitive learning processes that are really powerful. So self-explanation to yourself of what you're understanding, like through the written form, making your thinking visible to peers that can productively push on the ideas to kind of refine them, and that you're held accountable to a shared corpus of evidence and to a growing set of ideas that the community is working with. And I'll turn it back over to Bryn to take us into the second Q&A block.
Thank you, Phil, and everyone, you can see the reminders there on the screen about turning off those notifications, about minimizing or expanding your chat panel, and about continuing the discussion there in the NSTA Learning Center in the community forums. Take a look at those reminders there, and then I'll go ahead and move quickly on to our question break, handing it over to Ted Willard for probably just 1 or 2 questions, Ted, in order to stay on time tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Bryn. I'm just going to pull from a couple different points that I made here in the discussion that's going on. Some teachers who are pointing out that they feel challenged when it comes to limited resources they have in their classroom, whether it's questioning whether they can engage in some of the DNA activities that Leah had brought up, or access to enough computers for the classroom to engage in a lot of other things here. And I wondered whether any of you would like to give some sort of examples of how, of what can be done in a classroom, even with where there aren't a lot of resources in place.
Yeah, across the set of projects that we've worked on, some projects are much more kind of resource intensive than others. We have a series of projects, including the one that you'll hear about next, which is really using kind of the more far-flung KIT science curricula that is out in many districts to kind of refine it and to kind of focus it based on learning principles that are kind of more recent to the field. And so those are kind of much more broadly scalable and supportable. I do think that part of a challenge that we are working on is to bring kind of more resource-intensive investigations out to a broader number of places through public-private partnerships. So we are, with the high school example, really trying to think hard about, overall what is the price point of the curriculum relative to other investments that districts are making, so that we can kind of be in the zone of relating to the finances of a broader range of places. But at the same time, realizing that even then, trying to figure out who can come in to help subsidize and support that work can be very helpful. And I will say that the technology pieces are ongoing challenges in many places. It's not really predictable, so some of our kind of really high poverty schools actually have a great tech infrastructure and might even be one-to-one laptop spaces, but then others, they just don't. They have, kind of the more standard, computer lab that is under-resourced and has machines that are 4 or 5, more years old, and they're kind of trying to kind of make their way along. So, there aren't a perfect set of solutions, but those are my initial thoughts.
No, that's very helpful. Sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to chime in for just a moment, because I think no matter what resources that we're using in classrooms, I think the point of these practices is to allow students to get more experience doing some of the actual work that scientists and engineers do. So I think regardless of the activity that we're bringing them into in terms of the types of labs or the types of inquiry, for this practice in particular, give students the opportunity to write different kind of forms that scientists would write. So the abstract, or more of a research design plan, or maybe it's a proposal for funding, or whatever obviously fits with whatever activity you're doing. But I don't necessarily think it's necessarily has to be about their resources. I think it's more about just giving kids an opportunity to produce and generate and interact with text in ways that are a little bit more authentic to the disciplines themselves. That's what I think is important.
Great, thanks, Leah. I always found it interesting looking at some of the images that you had on your screen there, and the sort of Mac interface that was there, harkens back to, maybe even 1990s computers. I don't know if it's used currently or were from things you had done a while ago, but it points out how, it's not necessarily for a high-speed processor, fancy things going on here, or as you said, you can just, a paper and pencil approach. It's the information you're trying to collect in some cases, or the thinking you're trying to engage, not always just the technology that you're making use of. So why don't we go on and look at some of the other examples here, so we can then and do some questions after that.
Okay, thanks, Ted. So continuing on with our examples, as Phil said at the beginning, we've got an upper elementary example that we used in 5th grade, and then a preschool example. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this upper elementary example. This was helping students use research, and then they created public service announcements that communicated the science behind everyday health practices. And we want to acknowledge our colleagues, Carrie Zoe and Giovanna Scaloni, who have helped us tremendously with this work. Okay, so this was an off-the-shelf kit that our teacher colleagues were using. They didn't particularly love it, so they wanted to revise it. The content, it was focused on microbiology, and we all agreed that we wanted to make this a little bit more relevant to their students. And so we created a unit revising this kit that we called Micros and Me, so that students would have a direct tie into, all right, how do all of these microorganisms either benefit me, or in some cases, why do I need to worry about them? So what students did was, again, learning all about the science content involved. They also did things like we gave them, we had a class set of cameras, 5 or so, so every night students would check these out, and they would go home, go out into their communities, and they would take pictures of, the prompt was, what do you use to stay healthy to keep you from getting sick? So they would take these pictures, everything from cleaning products to medicines, to tea, just to all these different community and family and cultural practices that students were using to think about that prompt. What keeps me healthy? What keeps me from getting sick? And these became, these pictures, when they brought them back in, we created, you can see on the slide down here at the bottom right, this huge wall of all of these photographs, and this became data that students could analyze to look for patterns. And this spurred their research. And so they each picked a different research topic that had something to do with microbiology. And they created these public service announcements that I'll show you in a moment. So they were doing lots of different investigations of different aspects of microorganisms. You can see part 3 here, they're designing fair tests. So this was important because they were learning about different experimental elements of experimental design, controlling variables, things like that. They were doing these fair tests with hand washing. They were doing them, they were investigating yeast in some cases. This self-documentation, this was the picture-taking activity. And then part 4, as I've talked about, and this relates specifically to this practice, they were conducting this research project and creating these public service announcements. So here are some examples examples, and I hope you can, they're hard to read, but I hope you can get the gist. This one was about E. coli and how you might prevent or at least minimize your chances of contracting and getting an E. coli bacteria. And the interesting thing is about this PSA, this community, people were from all over the world, and many of the children had come with their parents from other countries. And so these PSAs were not only multimodal in terms of text and then different kinds of diagrams and things like that, but they were multilingual as well. So students were able to also write in their native languages. And some of the parents, many of the parents commented that it was, for them at any rate, coming to this country, one of the first times that they were able to participate in their children's schooling because they could help them with this. So here's another example. This is a student, her family drank a lot of tea, so she was just very interested in learning more about teas and in learning about was there any connection between microorganisms and tea. So the aspects of the practice that we wanted to highlight here is certainly through their research. We did a lot of work supporting them in obtaining information that was related to their research projects, to their research questions, their research topics, and then helping them evaluate, so is this decent information? Is it accurate information? Is it information that you'll actually be able to use to learn more about what your topic is? Let's see, so I've covered the second bullet there. And then as we talked about with the PSAs, the public service announcements, they produce these multimodal science and these PSAs, and then had to incorporate major features of science writing, as we've talked about with expository writing. They were informing, explaining, describing the subject of their research to their communities. And so then they took their public service announcements out into their communities, whether that was home or whether that was some other place, and they had to talk with members of their communities about the message on their PSA. In some cases that involved obviously a lot of explanation, evidence-based explanation. In some cases they were mounting arguments. And then they were bringing the conversations that they had with community members back into class so that we could all discuss aspects of those conversations.
Thank you, Leah. In this last example, we'll describe a collaborative effort between Tiffany Lee, the lead researcher on this project, and some pre-kindergarten teachers to integrate these practices, most scientific practices, into the pre-K classroom, but specifically this one. As a bit of a background on why we need to be doing science and science practices in preschool with our youngest students, is that historically, through a bad interpretation of Piagetian theory, young students were thought to only be concrete observational thinkers, and that this is present in much of the available curriculum. However, we know from research summarized in Taking Science to School that this is not necessarily the case, and that young children are competent thinkers, and that they bring knowledge of the world into schools, especially in domains such as mechanics, food, and energy. And this pre-K example shows one strategy for getting young students into the practice of obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. So in this particular set of classrooms where Tiffany is working, they developed research days from a need to address all of the questions that the students had been asking about the natural world and their varied interests related to the science unit. So the teacher couldn't address all of the questions in class, but they developed this practice so that all students could look at their various interests. The students were given class time to do their own research using relevant nonfiction books that were pre-selected by the teachers and the school librarian. And then they drew and dictated and shared their research finding with their peers. Students' research often built on the science knowledge that they had from their out-of-school learning experiences. And this practice reoccurred across the school year, so students became familiar about research days across the science unit. So here's an example of a research day. On this particular day, which happens later in the year, Eleanor was attracted to a book about ladybugs, especially by the illustrations, and the teacher came over to talk and read and scaffold her sense-making of the text, and also to capture her dictated summary that went along with Eleanor's drawing of ladybug and aphids. And she said, her summary was, sometimes ladybugs' food runs out, and there are not enough aphids to go around, and the ladybugs gather in a swarm and fly off somewhere near to survive. So she was connecting what she was reading in this particular book with the core idea that they were studying in class at that time. Animals depend on their surroundings for survival. So in this example of research days in the pre-K classroom, we see learners building on their interests and providing choice with appropriate scaffolding. The students were using multiple library resources to find information that could provide further evidence related to the core ideas in the unit that across multiple different topics, because students had different ideas and interests. They also could produce documentation of the information through drawing and dictation, and they were able to share their information with their peers and their parents and teachers through presentations to the class, and also a publication of the collected set of research papers from each unit, which was a meaningful culminating task for them.
All right, and now just to kind of wrap up a little bit, we'll talk about some challenges and opportunities, and we'll go to a third round of Q&A in just a moment. You know, science is filled with a lot of very precise technical language, and there's general academic vocabulary mixed in there as well. And there are kind of complex sentence structures. If you look at scientific abstracts as an example that we were talking about earlier today. So there are just challenges around getting students to kind of develop an understanding of those particulars of language. And I think we have posted a range of resources that attempt to try to do some of that work to support students in that work. And Leah gave some examples at the high school level, and I think there are existing strategies that could be more broadly used than are currently in use. There's also just, this practice is about multimodal representation of information. And so there's just a lot of unfamiliar representations that students might encounter that require time to make sense of, and engineering has its own set in relation to the set that are in the sciences. So it kind of puts a whole bunch of new ways of making sense of information on the table as a practice. We probably don't have quite enough time across K-12 to kind of work across the range of examples and formats that are in play. Part of the idea of the framework and the Next Generation Science Standards is to try to actually promote coherence, to coordinate things across grade levels a little bit more intentionally. And so we're hoping that over time that happens through curriculum design and coordination in ways that are maybe not happening as much now around this particular practice. There's also just a variation in terms of student fluency with doing this kind of search and synthesis of information. We've been working in some high schools where students have been doing this for years, and they're very deep into making sense of online collections of search results that come back from a query. But we're in other high schools where that's a very new practice, and students are really developing new understandings of how to be fluent with that broad set of information sources that are available through online spaces. And then generally, and I think we've been talking about this through the Q&A, that increasing opportunities to learn and engage in this practice have particular challenges, and trying to get kind of the inclusive science instruction going at scale is really kind of a developing research agenda for a lot of people, I think. And I think there's a growing emphasis there through curriculum design and through other professional development activities to kind of bring that into pre-service and in-service and try to think about how to do it in relation to our ever-diversifying society. So with that, I'll go on to the last slide, which is around opportunities. There are really great learning opportunities embedded in this practice. Deep engagements around reading and writing or communicating more generally, verbally or in text, have great learning affordances and actually should be embedded in student science and engineering investigations. We're happy to say a little bit more about how we, through our project, been kind of coordinating the learning goals that are in the framework and the developing NGSS drafts in relation to the Common Core ELA Science and Tech example, for example, and trying to help make things simpler by actually coordinating learning goals across those policy documents. This particular practice also is, I think, a wonderful one in the sense that it is multifaceted. It has lots of different dimensions to it. At the same time, it's very highly relevant to everyday life. And there are very dramatic, important forms of participating in our democracy that have to do with interpreting scientific information and making an informed choice and communicating science-related information for particular purposes. And so it has a very high personal utility to it. As students become fluent with it, it can serve a broad range of goals and interests. And the opportunities around digital media are expanding. There are just new forms all the time. You can post a representation of your scientific understanding through a particular format. One of the resources we shared is a series of instruction that's kind of a hip-hop styled instruction of students representing their ideas. And you can share that broadly and can be taken up and communicated. And there are new audiences for student work that are really quite powerful because of the digital media piece. So then finally, the resource collection we've been referencing, we decided to post it on Pinterest. So it's freely available, but if you go to this particular URL, we've posted about 40 resources that relate to the practice that we've talked about tonight and about the framework in NGSS a bit more generally. And we'll continue to post things to this particular collection. So if you have other ideas, we'd love to hear about them. So you can email them to us and share them. And then finally, we need to acknowledge the youth and families and teachers that we collaborate with to actually engage in this work together, to develop new curricula, new approaches to study learning. We also want to highlight Tiffany Lee, Carrie Zoe, and Giovanna Sloan, whose work we represented today on their behalf. This is work funded through the National Science Foundation, through the Gates Foundation, through different projects. So thank you for coming tonight, and I think we're going to go to our last Q&A session.
Actually, Phil, at this point, we're going to go ahead and go to Ted's wrap-up, and then we'll get to final questions after we answer our survey, everyone.
So I just want to point out to folks here that information about NGSS can be found at the NSTA's website, nsta.org/NGSS, including getting information from these slides. Want to point out a couple things that are happening in January. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be getting the second public draft of NGSS coming out, and in relation to that, we'll be having Stephen Pruitt from Achieve come to do a website and talk about the second draft, what they've done and changes they've made for the first draft. And so I really encourage you to look for that, as well as I and some of my colleagues at NSTA will be putting together a web seminar on how to lead a study group around NGSS. And if you want to get together with colleagues and think about how you can organize yourself to provide some uniform feedback to Achieve and to the writers. The specific dates for those are not firmly established yet, because we don't have firmly established a date for that. As soon as NSTA does know that, we will be putting that out through our various social media ways. If you follow us on Twitter or our Facebook page or some of the newsletters that we put together, I promise you will be the first to know about when it's specifically being released. We are following up with some other already scheduled pieces here around the practices. We know we've given a little bit of short shift to engineering practices. So Muriel Milano, who's one of the NGSS writers from Orange County Public Schools, is going to be talking in January about the engineering practices. We also haven't been able to focus as much on the elementary grades as we might like. So Heidi Schweingruber and Deb Smith. Heidi's from the National Research Council, and Deb Smith was also one of the members of the committee on the framework, are going to talk about the elementary levels. And in order to point to some of the relationship between NGSS and the framework and how practices also are dealt with in Common Core Math and Common Core English Language Arts, Sarah Michaels from Park University will be there. She's probably best known to this community as the author of Ready, Set, Science. Want to say that once that's done, we will be moving from practices in the spring into looking at the various cross-cutting concepts. So stay tuned for more information on those. Reminder that graduate credit has been available for people who have participated in all 8 web seminars or have watched the transcripts, and to keep an eye out for for that. We will be doing something similar to that in the spring. Our community forums are up and running. We have one specifically about the next generation science standards, and during the time when the draft framework is out, we'll open some additional top places for you to discuss particular sections of the standard. If you're, for example, interested in middle school life science, there'll be a forum specifically around that area. I also want to point out that our national conference in April will be probably the first real gathering of science educators after the release of the final version of NGSS, and I would say San Antonio is the place to be to learn all the final pieces there. And to point out, again, the framework which I've mentioned, and also a study guide that STA has put together, and also a set of journal articles that we've had about various aspects of the framework and standards, and including tonight's group of presenters had an article a few months ago on a similar topic, and so I encourage you to go and look and see their work there. And with that, I again really want to thank Phil, Leah, and Katie. I will admit that when I first looked at the practices, that the evaluating, communicating, and collecting information was not probably what I consider to be the most exciting practice, but as I've learned more about it, I have gotten a lot more interested in it as a real key piece in all of this work. And I hope that you guys are seeing that too as you come along through all of this. I'll pass things on to Bryn and to get this survey going.
Thank you so much, Ted, and I again would like to echo your comments and thank Phil, Leah, and Katie for their time this evening and for sharing their expertise. It was a fantastic presentation. Also would like to thank you, Ted, for your expertise throughout this series. And of course, we would like to thank the sponsor of today's web seminar, the Carnegie Corporation of New York. A thank you to the administration of NSTA for their support for web seminars. Here's a look at our upcoming calendar. Please join us tomorrow for one in our NASA Explorer School series. We'll be doing an engineering design, forces in motion, the balloon aerodynamics challenge. And then join us after the holidays to look at analyzing solar energy graphs, my NASA data. And then on the 9th, how to avoid disqualification in Explorer Vision. You can register for these programs and more in 2013 by going to learningcenter.nsta.org/webseminars. Thank you everyone for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you again on another web seminar.